Welcome to the Lockdown Lectures, where we're learning about the lives of some of Manchester's amazing researchers. Today we're joined by Professor of Sociology Claire Alexander. Claire is considered a leading expert on gangs, and her research focuses predominantly on issues of identity, race and ethnicity. Claire's career has been marked by several prizes and awards for her research and its impact. This includes the Guardian University Research Impact Award for the project Our Migration Story in 2019. Claire also remains committed to impact and public engagement as a trustee of the Stuart Hall Foundation and through her work with the Runnymede Trust. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you for inviting me to take part in today's event.
So firstly, how are you coping in lockdown, and what is the one thing that has got you through?
Well, I think I've actually coped much better in lockdown than I think I would have expected myself to. The transition to working from home has been much easier and smoother than I had imagined it would be, because I'm quite technophobic. And I'm very lucky and privileged, of course, that I can do most of my work from home. So I'm not on the front line. I'm not having to worry about balancing childcare and homeschooling and those kind of things. So I think I've been relatively fortunate. Work takes up most of my time. So mainly I'm the school research director in the School of Social Sciences. So a lot of my time is spent doing meetings, which gives structure to the day and takes up quite a lot of time. So I'm working to support my colleagues in preparations for the Research Excellence Framework, helping support colleagues who have got ongoing research projects which have been disrupted by the crisis, and also helping colleagues to put in new grants for future research. When I have time around that, I'm working on 2 research projects myself. One is with colleagues at the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity code, which is on racial inequality in higher education. And I'm also doing a project on the Indian restaurant trade in Brick Lane in East London. So we were lucky that both of the fieldwork on those projects were more or less finished by the time the lockdown happened. So we've been able to carry on with doing writing and dissemination events for those. And then when I have any extra time on top of that, I'm trying to write a book, which is revisiting my earlier study on the Asian gang. I don't have very much time for that. In terms of what's got me through when I'm not working, I have to say, I think actually it's been doing jigsaws, largely while singing along very badly and quite loudly to a kind of 1970s music channel. So I feel slightly sorry for my neighbours.
Those research projects sound really interesting. In terms of your research, was there a specific moment or event in your life that sparked your desire to pursue that area of research?
So, as you said at the beginning, my research has really been on race, ethnicity and identity, particularly with a focus on youth initially and masculinities, later on migration and diaspora, particularly for South Asians and Muslim. So I've been interested in kind of South Asian and British Muslim identities. I think for a lot of academics and certainly a lot of sociologists, my research interests come out of quite a personal set of circumstances. So I was adopted as a baby by a white English family. I grew up in the Cotswolds. I was the only person of colour in my village, which sounds a little bit Little Britain, but you know, I was the only non-white person in my school. I met my first black person when I was 17, and I met my first Asian person when I was 19 and went to university. So I had a very particular kind of experience. So I grew up, I think, as a lot of adopted children do, wondering where I fitted in. I was very different from my family in many ways. I was seen as very different by the people around me, and I was very aware of how people saw me, and how increasingly what they expected from me wasn't really how I saw myself or how I felt about myself. So I'd get the usual kinds of questions, which I think a lot of people of colour will tell you about, you know, which is the kind of, you know, but where are you from? No, but really, where are you from? And that was usually followed up with, my goodness, but your English is really quite good. And normally finished with, so are you having an arranged marriage? So there were those kinds of stereotypes that were very prevalent when I was growing up, which made me kind of really wonder about what, you know, what that meant and how people saw me and how I fitted in. And on top of that, I grew up through the 1970s and 1980s, when a generation of British-born Black and Asian young people were also kind of growing up and coming to kind of adulthood, and they were struggling with a lot of the same kinds of questions. And I remember very clearly seeing through the late 1970s and 1980s coverage of the kind of demonstrations against police harassment, later the riots in the early 1980s, and trying to work out how my experience related to the experience of those people who kind of looked like me but were also very different from me. And I think the moment I became a nascent sociologist was probably when I was about 16, and we had a visit in my school from a local police inspector. And it was just around the time that they'd started to publish for the first time crime statistics by race. And someone asked him a question about that, whether he thought that was okay, and whether, street crime really was a kind of predominantly black crime. And he said, yes, he absolutely thought it was okay. And he talked about black culture and black identities as being kind of inherently criminal. And I stuck my hand up and said, well, yes, but don't you think there might be more to it than that? Don't you think it might be about poverty, or don't you think it might be about education or unemployment? And he said to me, no, there is absolutely no other explanation. And I couldn't quite articulate what was wrong with that. And afterwards, I was made to go to the office and apologize to him for being rude. So I think that was part of where some of my kind of interest in social justice started at that point. I was particularly interested in the way ideas of stereotyping, how does that shape the lives and experiences of young Black and Asian people in Britain, but also wanting to move beyond the stereotypes and try and understand what those experiences were like for those young people themselves. So when I did my PhD, which was quite a lot later, I did my first degree in English. When I did my PhD in anthropology, it was on Black youth identities. And it was around the time of, this is going to really show my age now, but Soul to Soul became very popular. And there was a front cover of the Face magazine, which had a big picture of Jazzy B saying, the new funky face of Black Britain. And up at that point, people hadn't really thought of Black and British as even being remotely compatible, let alone being something that was really positive. So I really wanted to explore those identities. And then I followed that up later with a piece of postdoctoral research, which was on Asian youth identities around the time that there was a big moral panic about so-called Asian gangs. So again, I was kind of interested in the clash between the stereotyping and the way that people generally lived their lives. So I was really interested in how people confronted, negotiated, challenged stereotypes, if that was possible, how they lived their lives outside of those kind of stereotypes. And so my first project on Black youth identities was called The Art of Being Black. So it was partly about focusing on the creativity and the agency that young Black people had to kind of create their own sense of identity. So I was interested, I think, in the relationship between the individual and the society they grew up in, and also the tension between constraints, the kind of things that were put onto people and their individual choices. And you'll know this from your degree, but I mean, these are very classic social science research questions, right? Individual, society, constraint, agency. So that was really where I located my work. Those questions are the ones that have guided my research since then. So on Bengali migration and also on the restaurant trade. So again, the tension between how people are viewed, how people live, what people bring to British society. So I guess that was, recently I've become quite interested I've been working with a historian at Cambridge, Joya Chatterjee. So I've been interested as well in how identities change over time. So the Asian Gang project that I've been trying to find time to do is actually looking at how the young men that I interviewed in the mid-1990s were in 2012, 2015, so 15 or so years after I did those interviews. So they were all grown up, they'd got married, they had children, and seeing how those identities have changed over time as well. So I've become very interested in the kind of more historical dimensions.
And Claire, you talked briefly there about your research into gangs. Could you tell us a little bit more about this research and your experience of long periods of field work during your career?
So as I said, the two projects, my first two projects, and I think the projects that were closest to my heart actually were around youth, Black and Asian young men. And I was particularly interested in that relationship between stereotypes and lived experiences and the tension between those. And what was really interesting to me was how similar the sets of stereotypes were. So when I did the work in the late 1980s, 1990s, people were still talking about those stereotypes of kind of mugging and criminality, identity conflict, generational conflict, hypermasculinity, those kinds of things. And when I came to do the work with the Asian gang boys in the mid-1990s, a lot of those stereotypes were the same. They were talking about, kind of cultural conflict, identity crisis, generational crisis, family conflict. Those same sets of kind of arguments were working. So I was interested in the kind of continuity between those two different projects. But what I really wanted to do was get beyond the stereotypes. So I think partly because my first degree was in English, so I was really interested in stories and plot and narrative and getting kind of voices and characters more developed than you often got in social sciences. So for my master's and my PhD, because I wanted to do something that was not in books, that was actually kind of real life, I did social anthropology, and anthropology defines itself through ethnography. So doing long periods of fieldwork where you're immersed with the people that you're studying, trying to understand their viewpoint and their experiences. So unlike other kinds of research where you either have a kind of maybe a theory or a hypothesis that you want to check or test, or where you have a particular kind of topic that you want to very specifically focus on. This is more one where you just turn up and you just kind of hang around and you wait to see what happens. So you want those kind of issues and stories and experiences to come up almost naturally. I mean, it's not entirely natural, but that's the kind of idea. You go with an open mind and see what things matter to the people that you're working with. The advantage of doing ethnography, I think, is that because you spend a lot of time with people, you get to see them in different settings, you get to see how they change, you get to see how what they say and how what they do are not necessarily the same things. So it allows for a much more kind of rounded, complex, nuanced understanding, I think. So I kind of love that. Ethnography takes a long time and is very, very intense. So it's very difficult to do that once you get a proper job, I guess. So I was very lucky to have had the time to just spend time with them. So with the Art of Being Black young people, I lived with a group of guys for about a year and just kind of hung around with them, mainly going to nightclubs and things that the ESRC were not happy. And for the Asian Gang Boys, I actually worked with them for 5 years. I loved doing that project so much. I worked with them as a youth worker for 5 years. And actually, I still, 20 odd years on, I still see some of them. Some of them have been checking in with me over lockdown, actually, to make sure that I'm okay, offering to send me up emergency toilet rolls if I need it, so that's been quite nice. So they're very much part of my life. Often I think people think about urban ethnography in particular, so with the sociological end of ethnography, as being very easy, that you just turn up and you hang out and it's common sense and you just write what you see. Deep hanging out is one of the ways in which described. Or often they think it can be, people think it can be very exciting and glamorous, like you're doing some kind of undercover expose, kind of investigative journalism. And in my experience, neither of those things are right. Often it just involves quite a lot of hanging around, quite a lot of feeling quite stupid, probably looking quite stupid, often not knowing what on earth is going on at all. Crying at night because you think no one is ever going to speak to you. I did a lot of that. So it can be quite dull, quite frustrating sometimes. Sometimes dangerous, actually, in some cases. Not very often, I have to say, luckily. Sometimes just you find yourself in ridiculous situations. So across those two projects, I was mistaken a couple of times for being a prostitute. I was often mistaken during the Asian Gang project as being their mother. So people would say to me, are you their mother? And I'm standing there with kind of 8, 16-year-old boys, and I was 30. And I'm like, no, I'm not their mother. A couple of times I was threatened with violence. Once I had my car window smashed because I got into a row with one of the boys that I was working with. So there were those kind of moments. But on the whole, it was joyous. I think one of the things about ethnography is it requires you to recognize that you're not actually in control of what you're doing. Things are not in your control. And also that when things finally start to make sense, they're not at all like you thought they were going to be when you started out. So one of the things that I thought when I first did my PhD research in particular was that I would just go and do a piece of research and I would take all those terrible negative stereotypes about Black youth and discover the truth, and they would all kind of go away. What, of course, I discovered was that there is no such thing as a true picture, but also things are very, very kind of complicated. The reality is very complicated. So often there were times when the stereotypes couldn't be avoided. So, for example, my Asian Gang Boys, when they were younger would just kind of get picked up by the police because there was 3 of them walking down a road. Now that was because everything they saw was constructed through that lens, or they would get into a fight in the playground at school, and you'd get the special patrol group and dogs pulled out because people thought it was gang warfare, whereas it was 4 15-year-old boys. And sometimes people would use stereotypes for their own benefit. So quite often, I think, actually to attract girls. So one of the young men that I spoke to in the Art of Being Black project, and we were discussing the myth of black sexuality. And he said to me, no, Claire, you mean the legend of black sexuality. So there were ways in which people were able to kind of play with those. Yeah, so I think ethnography is a way that allows you to discover that complexity. It's an incredible privilege to be able to be part of people's lives in that way. I think it's one of the things that I value most about the work that I've done. And they become part of your life as well. So I think that's, does sometimes mean that you don't get away from them, but on the whole, it's really rewarding.
Thanks, Claire. That was a really interesting insight into your research. And now this next question is from Claire Hoffman on Twitter. And Claire asks, do you think there are lessons to be learnt from this pandemic in terms of inequalities in society?
Yes, I think that very often people think of the pandemic first and foremost as a kind of medical issue or a science issue. So people always talk about following the science. And it is that, of course it is that, but it's also a social crisis. So it affects individuals, families, communities, cities, nations, and it affects all of our relationships as well, from the very kind of personal to the most global. So, whether it's about your relationship with your parents who you now can't see, or whether it's about global supply chains, it's impacted our lives in lots of different ways, our social lives in lots of different ways. I think in particular what this crisis has thrown up in the UK is the impact of inequality. It's not surprising, and it's certainly not accidental, that the coronavirus has had more impact in poorer communities. So the death rate, I think, is twice what it is in other communities. So it affects dramatically people who are vulnerable in a whole range of ways, whether that's through age or through poverty, or, one of the things that obviously interests me very particularly is the kind of overrepresentation of BAME people and communities in that. So I think the significance of this is in 2 ways. Firstly, I think the crisis has really pointed to the absolutely crucial role that BAME people and communities have played in the kind of life of Britain. So in the NHS, obviously, in the care service, but as bus drivers, as taxi drivers, as supermarket workers, so I think that's been made much, much clearer through this. And the disproportionate rates of death and serious illness, I think, also point to the kind of ongoing reality of racism in British society, actually, which leads to social and economic inequality. So it's about where people live, how people get to work, where people are employed, often in really quite dangerous, quite poorly paid, unprotected kinds of services. It says a lot about how they're valued. I think there are interesting questions to be answered around the overrepresentation of medical BAME medical deaths, for example. So I've been working with colleagues with Code until recently on a book which came out, which is called Race and Inequality in the UK, the State of the Nation. And that tracks some of those kind of the kind of current picture around social inequality for BAME groups, and how those have changed over time and how they're kind of quite entrenched. So it looks at education, it looks at employment, housing and health. So it captures some of those kind of patterns and how those patterns are now we're seeing being very dramatically played out. Because inequality has consequences. It has life and death consequences. And I think that's been highlighted really dramatically. The second point, I think, which is really interesting and important, particularly in the kind of Brexit context, is it very much kind of blows up the idea that Britain is an island nation that can just kind of go it alone. Britain's completely dependent on migrants and minorities for its survival, and actually it always has been. So one of the projects I've been working on for the past 10 years, really, with the Runnymede Trust, has been around developing a resource pack for teachers. You mentioned the Our Migration Story website, and that's mainly about telling the story of Britain as a nation, and British history through 2,000 years, through the kind of lens of Britain as a nation of migration, which it is and has been from the Romans onwards. So challenging the idea that Britain is an island, and talking about it as a story of kind of migration from everywhere and all kinds of people, settlement, and the kind of change and transformation that they've brought to Britain. The National Health Service is an absolutely classic example of that, but this is a much longer story of the way in which Britishness has been forged. So I'm kind of hoping that the pandemic will help people think differently about Britain and what Britain is and who is British and what Britishness is. Though I have to say I'm hoping, I'm not necessarily that hopeful.
Thank you, Claire, for taking the time to chat with me today. It was great to hear more about your research and your career, so thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you very much.